The path of yoga that we're focusing on is the jnana yoga path. And the jnana yoga path really works on or focuses on the mind observing daily life, or we could say what's here, and discerning, coming to see things that are relevant to the topic that is at hand. And as things are understood, as things are seen with more nuance or more subtlety, then conclusions can be formed and old conclusions fall away. So an example would be to become aware of the impermanence of things. And that awareness of the impermanence of things is preceded by a thought and a thinking about permanence and impermanence. And, so we actually need to understand or come up with a concept of what permanence is and what impermanence is. And once we have the concept of permanence, let's say that which is always here or that which doesn't change, that would be a simple concept of what permanence is. And impermanence is that there is, or that something doesn't stay or isn't always here, that something is changing. It is not permanently the same. So once we have those two concepts, then we might start observing the actual things. And we might conclude based on our observance of them. Take, for example, a wooden table that you've had outside, and you know that over time it changes. And we could say it changes because it's exposed to the weather. And that's just a very crude example. So we might say, the table is not permanent. Your house ages. Wood put into a fire is turned into ash. And so we can say, the wood is not permanent. And as we observe more and more things, we might then start observing more subtle things and say, my thoughts are not permanent. My various states or experiences, the different emotions, let's say, that we have are not permanent. They're here one moment and then they change. And so we come to understand the permanence and impermanence of things. That is an understanding of the nature of life that we mightn't have had before we heard about the concept or thought about the concept of permanence and impermanence. And it's teachings that might talk about permanence and impermanence, which is what might inspire us to think down a certain line. So the path of jnana yoga tends to be a path of feeding the intellect with pointers, concepts, or concepts to think about because they are relevant. And then the seeker, if there is a resonance with a particular concept that they might hear or read about, will do its own investigation, its own crunching of that topic. And it may not get to the point. It might conclude that permanence or impermanence means this. Whereas the actual concept of permanence and impermanence might be able to be developed much more than their concept has been developed to, and because there could be many more layers of nuance or subtlety, or there could be impermanence that can be attributed to factors of life that the person hasn't even become aware of. Consciousness, for example. Consciousness is not as obvious as a table. And so someone might conclude, oh yeah, the table is impermanent, and may go through looking at all of the physical objects in their environment. They might then look at less tangible objects like thoughts and emotions, and it might stop there because certain components in the environment may not be visible, not necessarily sight-wise visible, but may not fit into their field of awareness. And therefore, the impermanence of that aspect might never pop up. And if it does then present itself, and the concept of impermanence is applied to that layer of life, then that might reveal something striking that they hadn't understood because it hadn't been applied to that layer of life. And so we can see how we might think we understand a topic or a concept, but it might not be fully developed. And there might not be such a thing as fully developed. But we could say there is fully developed relative to certain objectives, let's say, or certain outcomes. There, in a way, there's no need for something to be developed past a certain point for certain topics. It's about like a level of accuracy. You know, if you're building a wooden gate, your accuracy might need to be plus or minus 1 millimeter. And so going down to plus or minus 1 micron is irrelevant. Whereas when building certain high precision instruments, the accuracy might need to be 10 microns. And so it really depends on what the objective is as to whether someone's understanding of a topic is full or not, let's say. So anyway, Jnana Yoga is a path that includes thinking about things, not about everything. It's not about thinking about chemistry, for example. If chemistry doesn't apply to the topic at hand, so what is the topic at hand? There's a word that I'm sure you might be able to guess that's used a lot, and maybe is the umbrella word for what seekers are looking for. In practical terms, that word you might say, you might guess, because I'm sure you might be thinking, okay, there could be 2 words, could be what seekers are looking for. So happiness or peace of mind might be one of your answers. That would be the practical answer. And the not so practical word people are looking for is enlightenment. So I think it's great if you as a seeker, so I'll come across the notion that actually enlightenment is happiness or peace of mind. If you don't hear that, then you just have this word enlightenment. Then you have to ask, what is enlightenment? And you might not get the answer that It's happiness or peace of mind. And mind you, even getting the answer happiness or peace of mind would not be much use, because the intellect, the mind, or our thinking will give those words, happiness and peace of mind, unless it's specifically spelt out, which I like to do. We say, oh, I'm looking for happiness, or I'm looking for peace of mind, and our thinking will imagine something that is not at all the happiness or peace of mind that is really being spoken about, that is being pointed at. So peace of mind, which happens to be happiness, it's safer to use the word peace of mind, because happiness is more likely to engender an idea of some sort of pleasure, like joy or excitement. So happiness is not joy or excitement. Happiness is peace of mind. And if we leave it at peace of mind, what is peace of mind? The mind is probably going to turn that into some feeling of peace. Oh, this is so peaceful. This feels so nice. No, not that. Peace of mind is best described as the elimination, the absence of something that was there before. The absence of suffering. What is suffering? Suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself. So, peace of mind, happiness, enlightenment is when we live life and there is not the presence of uncomfortableness with oneself. And that doesn't feel like anything positive. It's positive if we compare the absence of suffering to the presence of suffering. So when there is the presence of suffering, we don't feel at ease, we don't feel content, we don't feel comfortable with being here. And so when that is taken away, we could say, oh, that's a great relief. It's such a great relief that that uncomfortableness is gone. But you're not given comfortableness. Comfortableness is not a new positive feeling. This is a bit tricky for the intellect to grasp. The intellect tends to create a concept about something, and so it's turned it into something. And so a good example is forgetting. You know, we have a word, oh, I forgot. What does forgetting look like? Like, what is the act of forgetting? Does your brain produce forgettingness? It's the absence of the remembering. Now, so remembering is the product. It is producing, or it is the presence of something. So to remember is the presence of the thought that says, I need to put the rubbish out. So remembering is something. It is the presence. When you forget, you don't have a thought that says, oh, don't put the rubbish out, when in fact you need to have the thought, put the rubbish out. It is just the absence of the thought, put the rubbish out. So it's not something. And yet, because we have a word for forgetting, the brain has attributed a word to that state. And so it thinks forgetting is something, when it's actually a description of the absence of something. It's the absence of remembering. And what is remembering? Remembering is just a thought. The thought, I need to put the rubbish out. And then we say, I remembered, because we didn't forget, which is not the doing of anything, it's the absence of the thought. I need to put the rubbish out. So this discussion about forgetting and remembering is food for the intellect to maybe then take that analogy, that concept further, and come up with its own insights. Because I might say something like peace of mind is the absence of suffering and it is not something. And we might sort of go, oh yeah, I can repeat that. If there was a question, what is peace of mind? And there was multiple choice and there were 3 of them, and you'd say C, the absence of suffering. You go, oh, it's definitely C. And if we think about it and we really get it ourselves, we know it's C for a better reason than just remembering that's the concept that was in the talk. It starts to be known for ourselves based on an observation of the suffering, and then at times the awareness that all suffering is not here. And we might be looking for the end of suffering, and we've had it. Well, I assume every human has had periods of no suffering during the day. So today, I'm sure all of you have had some periods of no suffering, but it's not going to stand out as impressive. It's going to be very unimpressive unless you compare it to the presence of suffering, and then it's a relief. But it's not particularly remarkable if you don't compare it to the presence of suffering. So what I mean by that is, if you have, what I mean by the absence of suffering is, you might find yourself discontent, doubting, wondering what the purpose of life is, feeling like you're not achieving what you need to achieve. All of that is an uncomfortableness with oneself. You might feel anxious, you might be resentful, you might be judgmental of how people are acting or what's happening in the world of finance or the world of politics or the world of your neighbor. And when that thinking and those feelings are present, we can say that that is uncomfortableness or suffering. And there can be subtle or intense forms of suffering. So let's take anxiety, which tends to be something that is quite noticeable when it's there. That is the presence of suffering. And if you get distracted, the anxiety might actually fade away. And you might not even notice that the anxiety has gone. Rather unremarkable. Unless, of course, the anxiety was really intense and there was a really strong uncomfortableness, a bit like, using an analogy, a really strong headache, and then the headache stops and you could go, oh, that's such a relief. So the contrast is what allows us to notice it. If, on the other hand, you had a headache and you were doing other things, you weren't particularly focused on the headache, or the headache wasn't really strong, and it might fade away without you even realizing it, until maybe hours later you realize, oh, I don't have a headache anymore. And you mightn't have had that headache for the last hour and not even noticed it. So enlightenment is the end of suffering, which I would say many people have experienced in short bursts, or maybe long bursts, but from time to time suffering arises. And those short bursts or those long bursts seem unremarkable because they don't seem like anything special, because there's nothing there, no bliss, no special powers, no knowing the secrets of the universe, nothing you've gained. It's just the state free of uncomfortableness. And yet, if I say that's enlightenment, so enlightenment is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, where the suffering no longer arises in life. But what would that look like? That would look like those periods of time that everyone has extended, so that no circumstance creates the uncomfortableness with oneself. So if you want to understand enlightenment and know what it is, start knowing what it is for yourself. The way that is knowable is to really become aware of the different forms of suffering. Become aware of them both intellectually, that means understand the descriptions or what the word suffering refers to in practical terms. And in this framework, we say it's guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. Those are the 5 categories, you could say. And guilt, blame, pride, worry, and anxiety are really all attitudes to our actions, the actions of the other. So our actions, and guilt is an attitude towards our actions that didn't turn out so well or weren't ideal. Blame is an attitude to the actions of the other. Pride is an attitude to our actions that did deliver positive outcomes. Worry and anxiety is an attitude towards the future. And expectation and attachment to outcome is also an attitude towards the future. That's the expectations, is where we are thinking about the future, saying this is how it needs to be. This is what will be acceptable. And attachment to outcome is the feeling of resistance when the actual outcome turns out the way it does, which is only ever one way and often not in line with our expectations. Sometimes we get what we want, sometimes we don't get what we want, and sometimes, Ramesh used to say, we get much more than what we want. We don't tend to have an attachment to outcome that is noticeable when we get what we want or we get much more than we want. But when we don't get what we want, then we can see the attachment to outcome arising in relation to our attitude towards things not having turned out the way we want. The resistance and this feeling of uncomfortableness that stems from a deeply ingrained belief that my completeness, my happiness is heavily dependent on things turning out as I would like them to turn out. And so if that's the deeply ingrained belief, which really means sense of who we are, I am someone that is determined or dependent on what happens in the future, and that I will be complete if the future is as I would like it, and if it's not, I am attacked, I am diminished, I am less than complete. So if we have that sense of self, it makes sense that when an outcome is not in line with our expectation, there is essentially a non-acceptance of it, a big resistance to it, because we feel like it is essentially a mini death. It has killed part of who I am, and so we resist that. And the truth is that outcomes are not what determine our happiness. Outcomes are not an attack on who we really are. And so there is a need for us to come in contact with this aspect of ourself that is actually not dependent on outcomes. So that leads me into an explanation of why is enlightenment so often referred to as the realization of self. Why is enlightenment often spoken about as the awakening of awareness to awareness, or awareness becoming aware of itself? So when I say, well, enlightenment is the end of suffering, or peace of mind. Suffering is essentially the conflict of mind, the conflict between what we would like and what actually is. And peace of mind is when there is no conflict, meaning that there is an acceptance with what is, and that acceptance comes when essentially the mind stops creating an expectation and understands that life will turn out just one way, not my way. So no point in having an expectation. That's just going to lead to this dissonance. And how is it possible? Is it possible to not have expectation? It's not possible when the sense of self remains in place as it is put in place by life, which is I am something that is dependent on outcomes. I am added to by pleasure or by positive outcomes, and I'm attacked or subtracted from when negative outcomes. If that identity remains in place, there's no question of accepting. We are automatically going to have an expectation, and that expectation is for life to turn out in the way that will make me complete. If, on the other hand, it becomes apparent because of connecting, you could say, a grounding into, a becoming aware of an aspect of ourself that is not defined by outcomes, the more that there is a familiarity with that, a knowing ourself as that, knowing us, our essence as being something not determined by the flow of life. The flow of life really means how circumstance unfolds. If that becomes intimately experienced, meaning we get to be that which is not determined by the flow of life, then the mental movement that insists on life falls away. And then when life turns out one way, there is what we call acceptance, which is not anyone doing acceptance. acceptance is like forgetting. It is the absence of non-acceptance. There's no such thing as positive acceptance, where I accept this scenario. No, as long as we find that non-acceptance doesn't arise, that is acceptance, and it is not something. It is like forgetting. Forgetting is the absence of the presence of the memory, the thought, I must put the rubbish out. Acceptance is the absence of the presence of the non-acceptance. And the non-acceptance is, no, this can't be happening. This is not acceptable. It is an attack on who I am. And that might be a thought. It might be a response, an actual response, or it could be a feeling. So why is enlightenment referred to as knowing thyself, or awareness becoming aware of itself? Because that is the essence of the human being, that is essentially the component or the aspect of the human being that turns out to be the core, without which there would be no awareness of life, no awareness of being human, no awareness of the external world. That turns out to be the component that we could call self, or the subject, what is also referred to as I amness, or isness, or beingness, consciousness. It is the aspect of the human that includes the awareness and the sense of existence. And it is that aspect that is not thought based. It is prior to thinking. It is not a product of our thinking. The psychological self, the sense of self that we have, that has been put in place by life, meaning put in place by how we observe the world, and how our perceptions take in the world. So from a very young age, a sense of self gets put in place, and it might be revealed that our sense of self, the one that is put in place as the normal development of life, is actually a conceptual idea of who we are. And as part of that conceptual idea of who we are, we have a conceptual idea of what we need. We have a conceptual idea of how the other should act. We have a conceptual idea about how I should act. And any eventuation outside of or in contradiction to that conceptual idea is felt as an attack on who I am. And that insistence, that attachment to things being a particular way because it feeds back into this psychological, which is a conceptual sense of self, can fall away once it is seen to be exactly that. And this I amness is prior to concept. It exists without us needing to have a thought about who we are. It is the essence of the human being. So someone said to me the other day, they said it's strange, or I said, isn't it strange how we get older, we age, and then we can think about ourselves, or we can think back to younger years when we were very different. We had different physical attributes, we had different interests, and it's sort of, there are these periods of life where you sort of shift out of being, in a way, a particular personality. And when you look back, so if you're in your 60s and you look back at your 20s, it sort of seems like almost like a different person. And I say, isn't it funny to look back at when we were at a very different age, had very different interests? And the person said, yes, but, and they're in their 70s, this person, and they said, but I still feel young. And I suggested that what they're saying is a feeling of being young is actually the non-conceptual feeling of self. That is what we have always felt ourselves to be at our core. And it just turned out that sense of self that hasn't actually changed over time started off presenting in a body that was young of age. And then in a body old of age, the person says, I still feel young. And I said, well, I don't think that is actually a feeling of youngness. What it is a feeling of who you are that you originally knew when you were in a young body. And it's a concept of ours. It's a mistake, essentially, a critical thinking error, to say that is what it feels like to be young. I said, no, that's what it feels like to be yourself. And so that sense of self is prior to concept. It's an emanation, it is a essence that says, I am, I exist. We will then on top of that have all sorts of ideas about I am successful or I am not successful, I am moral or immoral, I am a mother or a father, a brother, a sister, an engineer, a gardener. So we can have all sorts of concepts of who we are, but the very primal sense of isness, which is also, we can call it I am, but it's not a mental I am. It is let's just call it a feeling. But it is prior to, it's not of the same nature as feelings of, let's say, hunger that come in, or feelings of tiredness, or feeling of being cold or hot. It is a more primal sense of existence. And it's what then, it's what the thought, I am this and that, is built on. The only reason we say I am this or that is because there is this primal sense of I am. And so our attention needs to go on to that and realize that there is an I amness that is prior to thought, and it is prior to being I am a mother or I am a father, I am a doctor or a gardener. They are the mental labels of what we are, and they're not even that accurate, because if someone says I am a doctor, they are not a doctor at sometimes. Sometimes they might be gardening, so in that moment they're a gardener, and They're not only a doctor, they might be a husband or a wife or a daughter. And so these labels, I'm a doctor, is essentially quite generalistic and not that accurate. We are a person, really, and even I am a person is maybe missing the fact that I am. There's nothing, the feeling I am is prior to the thought I am. Even the very just simple, the thought I am is not the feeling I am. The thought I am, when Nisargadatta said, I am that, he was using those words, I am that, to describe the fundamental basic I amness sense that is overlooked because we have all of these conceptual ideas of who we are, not realizing that the only reason that these conceptual ideas of who we are exist because there is this primal sense of existence. If that sense of existence was turned off, switched off, there would be no sense of I am in the world. There would be no sense of consciousness. So that is the true self, on top of which the personality and all of that is built. And we really do need to come back to that that level, which is a primordial level, and know ourselves there. And that then allows the conceptual parts, the conceptual self, to be seen as a conceptual self. And it's not that all of the movements of the person outside of the I amness, so on the outer layers of the I amness, there is the physical layer that is wrapped around the I amness, and then there are there's the working mind, and there are preferences and our personality, and a lot of that is not that's not the core of the psychological self that suffers. The sages, like, let's take Ramana, when the psychological sense of self fell away and there was a revelation of his primal I amness, Ramana continued to have intellectual thoughts. He was able to have conversations with people. He was able to understand how food was prepared, and that food needs to be prepared in a certain fashion to prevent it from being contaminated. So he was interested in how the kitchen worked, and he would instruct people and get annoyed with people if they weren't preparing the food in certain ways. And so the personality and certain thinking faculties don't fall away. He continued to respond to his name when he was called. He continued to have his consciousness linked to his particular body. If someone were to come and start hitting the body we know as Ramana with a stick, there would be sensory feedback within his field of awareness of the pain. Whereas if some other body was hit with a stick, and let's leave out the fact that he might feel compassion or anger towards the fact that some other body is being hit with a stick, if that was outside of his awareness, there would be no sensory feedback to Ramana unless he had special powers that are not a necessity with enlightenment. So we might as well assume that they didn't exist. He didn't have a link to other people's bodies, but his body still acted as the vehicle in which that consciousness was, or through which that consciousness was functioning. And so once the I amness is realized, certain attributes of the individual continue to be there. What falls away is the psychological sense of self that judges life. The sense of discernment is still there. So if he sees the cooks preparing meals in an unhygienic way, he can discern that that is not hygienic. And there will still be biological reactions that will arise as you get angry. How many times do I have to tell you to not chop the vegetables next to the cow manure? But the judgment that is in opposition to what is happening on a level of who I am is not there. So the biological response, how many times do I have to tell you, doesn't penetrate down to the sense of self, which is why in the next moment he could be laughing with the person he's just scolded. Whereas if the judgment is there, then it is taken personally. The other person is seen to be the doer, and that they shouldn't be functioning like that, and life shouldn't be turning out like this. Whereas one of Ramana's sayings is everything happens according to the great ordainer. Everything happens according to consciousness or source or God's will. The great ordainer is a term for source, meaning not you or I, as in not the person is not the one that determines how the universe unfolds. He says, what is destined to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to stop it from happening, it will happen. What is destined to not happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it happen, it will not happen. With this understanding, the best response is silence. And the silence he's talking about is the silence of the thinking mind, not the discerning mind, which is part of the working mind, but the silence of the thinking mind, which is the psychological self that sees the other as the doer and oneself as the doer, and believes that one's completeness is dependent on outcomes. And that is the end of suffering. The end of suffering because the essence of oneself has become appreciated, and from that perspective, which is an unidentified perspective, which means that life can be witnessed and seen as a whole, rather than from the identified perspective, life is seen as me and everything outside of me. From the dimension of self, the true self, which is further back than the body, further back than the thoughts, further back than the emotions, then life is seen as a dance of consciousness. And so from that place, the psychological dynamic, the psychological thoughts are able to be seen for what they are, which is a misunderstanding of who we are, a misunderstanding of the nature of life. And in time, they get less prevalent, weaker and weaker and weaker, and eventually stop happening. And when they stop happening, we could say that is the total understanding. The total understanding of who we are and how life unfolds, meaning life is a happening, not my doing, not the other's doing. And I and the other are part of that happening, not separate from it. My thoughts, my feelings, my actions, the other's thoughts, feelings, actions are all part of the happening of the greater whole. That is the understanding of life, and that understanding of life comes from an understanding of self. Comes from being able to witness life from that dimension. Now, we also hear about this word witnessing and knowing ourself as the container in which life happens, awareness. That fades away in my experience. That is not enlightenment. Enlightenment is the consequence of that having been revealed and then fading into the background. Now, fading into the background doesn't mean it is lost. It doesn't mean that it is forgotten. It means it has become completely integrated such that it is no longer, the spotlight is no longer needed to be placed on that aspect of self. It also, the fading away of the appreciation of awareness in the way that happens as part of the process, the fading away of awareness comes when an integration takes place. And the integration is where we re-include aspects of the person that were relegated to the realm of not who I am. And those aspects of the person, like the body, the thoughts, the emotions, are often relegated to the category of not what we are in order to put the spotlight on that aspect of ourself that has been covered over, has been overlooked. And it's essentially saying, don't worry about that, don't worry about that, don't worry about that. You are not any of that. And once all of the objects that we have identified with that are essentially obscuring the deeper sense of self have been relegated to the not real category or not who you are category, there may well be a realization of this consciousness, this I amness that is non-conceptual and only exists here now in the present moment. You can't know your I amness of when you were 10 years old. That time has passed. But you can know the I amness that is here now, and when you know the I amness that is here now, you will know that that was what was there when you were 10, but you can't remember it. If you try to remember the I amness, that is in the realm of a concept of I am. Any memory you have is the past. It's the dead past. It's not the thing itself anymore. And our intellect and our conceptualizing has become such a strong force that even in the present, even the things that exist in the present moment are not appreciated because we live through our idea of life. And so this is why teachings use a methodology to allow us to hopefully push us out of the conceptualizing and bump into the present moment. And in the present moment, that which is here now, when we really connect to the presence, which we can start off by doing through the senses and then even move past the idea that I am aware because of my eyes or my ears, and realize there is just awareness of what is now. The teachings will use certain methodologies to push us into the present moment, out of our conceptualizing. That is happening even in present day. We're still stuck in the world of conceptualizing until we get pushed out of it. So enlightenment is the end of suffering. Suffering is a form of conceptualizing. That conceptualizing is not something that can stop unless we get pushed out into the dimension, we could say, the timeless dimension of consciousness. It's called the timeless dimension of consciousness because when we are pushed out of our idea of life, our idea of self, there is no such thing as past or future. We will see that the idea of the past and the future is a concept. I lived in the past, or I existed prior to this moment, and we have no actual proof of that. We have a concept that we might believe unquestionably. So, of course I believe, of course I lived in the past. I say, how can you prove it? Right now, what proof is there? And someone would say, I have a memory. I say, well, isn't a memory just a thought arising in the present moment? How do you know that that's not a complete fiction that is creating the impression of a past? I'm not saying it is a fiction. I'm saying, how do you know that it is not a fiction? And we don't know that it's not a fiction. Someone who just won't question their understanding of what memory is and where it comes from will say, well, I have a memory because it happened. Do we know that that is definitely how memory arises? That's assuming, when we say that's the case, we assume life is as it appears on the surface. Maybe it's more complex than that. Maybe it isn't, but we have to come to the point where we say, actually, I don't know that the past existed. What we do know is that I exist now. But this is all there is. And when we are resting in that existence, without any thinking or without any talking at first, because the thinking and the talking prior to being heavily established in that dimension, or rather prior to the psychological self having dissolved, thinking will tend to keep us out of a recognition of the timeless dimension. So in that timeless dimension, there is an awareness of now, and maybe a laughing at the fact that, and I don't know about anything else, but I know I am now. That might also require the appreciation that the physical world is not permanent, and in its extreme, in the extreme realization of that, we might be open to the consideration that the physical world is actually not a physical world. Because if we have the concept that is the unquestioned concept that my house is made of bricks, then in being here now, because there is an awareness of the walls that we say are walls made of bricks that were kilned 20 years ago and laid by a bricklayer 20 years ago, by being present with a house that in our head was built 20 years ago, means that our sense of self is a sense of someone in a world of time. So you can see how there are hidden layers or hidden concepts contained in our assumption of what is in front of us, that we might not even realize are keeping us in the time-bound reality. And so we might think, oh, I need to be in the present. And the present might include a seeing of a wall that we are unconsciously relating to as a physical wall that must have been built yesteryear. If we appreciate that it is impermanent, if we see that the wall is impermanent, we might even appreciate that the wall doesn't exist in our experience sometimes. So on the one hand, we might say, oh, the wall is impermanent because someday the house will be demolished. Or on a microscopic level, all substance is changing. If we take that impermanence to the ultimate degree, we will see it doesn't exist in my experience except for now. And that if I am not in this room, or if the experience is of the garden, for example, the wall ceases to exist. And an appreciation of that then means, so what is the wall when it exists? The wall when it exists is an appearance in my consciousness. And there are times when it is not present in my consciousness. And what is my consciousness? The daily life experience is an arising in our consciousness. Sometimes there is the presence of a room and a wall. Other times there is the presence of a garden or streetscape or ocean, mountains. And they are all impermanent. They're not always there. So we may then stop looking at them as physical realities and appreciate them as impermanent arisings in consciousness. And so coming into the present, where I don't know that I existed yesterday. I don't know that I will exist in some imaginary future. I do know I exist now. and that the whole experience as it arises is a spontaneous creation right now. That won't be here in the next moment. And so if you're in the room and you think, oh, it's still here in the next moment, it's not the same. It's all moving and changing. The person that is moving is part of the whole experience in the moment. It's not that the wall is the same experience and then the person is the perceiver of that wall. The physical body and the wall and everything else in the room is in continuous flux. And there is something beyond the changing experience that is aware of the present moment. So in the journey, sometimes we're seeking, or always we're seeking enlightenment, let's say. Often we have no idea what that is. At some parts of the journey it becomes more clearly defined, and in some parts of the journey it is a seeking for our true self. And at another part of the journey it will be redefined for actually what I'm looking for is simple happiness in daily life. And what is that? That is the end of suffering. And so as the focus changes from knowing thyself or awareness becoming aware of itself, presence, the remaining psychological structures can be looked at. When we make it about practical daily living and happiness in practical daily living, because that's when attention then focuses on what am I looking for in practice. I'm looking for happiness, which is the end of suffering. And what are the forms of suffering? And then we will see where an integration of the realization hasn't happened, where the suffering arises. That is because in the system there is still a sense of self that is different from the self that has revealed itself. And having an awakening to the sense of self that is prior to thought is not sufficient to eliminate the psychological structures. It is the grounds on which the psychological structure may eventually be dissolved. But in and of itself, having an awakening experience doesn't dissolve the psychological structure. In fact, a lot of people have an awakening experience and have no idea what happened. And it's sort of just something that happened 20 years ago. It had a completely different qualitative sense, and yet there may be no real benefit in it because the psychological structure remains in place and the suffering continues, and there's just a craving for this thing that happened 20 years ago, thinking that that is it. And for others, there is an awakening that happens, and it is there is a capacity to abide in that on a more frequent basis, meaning that their destiny is for there to be abiding in it on a more and more abiding basis. There's always going to be flip-flopping where we get pulled out of it, but then there might be the movement back into abiding in I am and being aware of awareness and aware of the present moment as a spontaneous arising. And then that appreciation of self needs to be integrated back into daily living, where the aspects of the human being, the body and the thoughts, are allowed to become part of what we know ourselves as. So I'm a human being, the core of which is consciousness, but a human being that has to live their life in this apparent world of form as an apparent human object, but with the awareness of the consciousness that runs through the core, with a particular personality, with my good points and my bad points, with destiny unfolding such that sometimes life will deliver pleasure and sometimes pain. If the understanding is total, then the suffering that so often arises simultaneous to the flow of life no longer arises. So, on that note, I'll take a few questions. Francois.
I have to put them. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I watched a video of you that was 4 years ago, and I followed on it, and the title was "You must come back into the body or to the body," and it was very interesting because it was the first time I heard you very sharp on this idea of distinguish the reaction of the body, and so I'm a bit confused because it was not clear in my head right now because I was listening to you. So I'll try to say directly what I was thinking about. The fact that my understanding is very sharp, as you might remember, about how it goes. And I don't even really care or believe in enlightenment. And in the end of suffering is like almost a preference for me, but not like a real goal. And so I discover through your satsang that I talk about that definitely my body was feeling discomfort sometime, and like some kind of stress or thing like that. And the understanding I had, so like we say, my working mind was dealing with it with no problem because it was like everything can happen, it's an happening. But still, it was like, as you say, could it disappear completely? And I was wondering if you, in your own experience right now, since you have been yourself, do you still feel some times of discomfort that you may almost call suffering, but that doesn't disturb your peace of mind?
So we need to make a certain distinction. When you talk about uncomfortableness in the body, right? It could be interpreted as you could have a stomach ache, let's say, or a headache or a sore back. And that obviously could be called a discomfort in the body.
Yeah, it was not about physical pain.
Yeah. And then we can have an uncomfortableness on the more subtle levels of self, let's say, where could be anxiety or it could be doubt. And I think that's more of what you're talking about. And often we hear people say, when there is a realization of this awareness, this consciousness, then there is a witnessing of whatever happens as an arising in the present moment. And there is no involvement in what is arising, because there is no one, they would say, there is no one to whom it is happening. It is just a movement like clouds in the sky. Now, that to me is a description of the movement towards the end of suffering, right? Because obviously, if there wasn't that witnessing with the attitude that, yes, this is one of the colors of life, and what to do, because it's one of the colors of life, I therefore don't get involved. We could, the person would say, there is no need to get involved with it, because if I get involved with it, I'm saying it's not one of the colors of life. Or attitudinally, I'm saying this shouldn't be one of the colors of life. So there is involvement in it. And so they would say, no, what happens now is suffering might arise, but it is witnessed. Now that is a huge movement towards peace of mind. And someone would say, in fact, that is peace of mind. I would say that is relative peace of mind compared to when there was involvement in the suffering. Now there is no involvement in the primary suffering. So there is the primary suffering, but no secondary involvement in it. Because there is still the primary suffering, be it anxiety or blame, but no one saying, oh, I shouldn't blame. There is just, oh, blaming is happening. Judging is happening. But I'm not saying I shouldn't judge. I'm not saying I should judge. It's just allowed to be there. That is the primary suffering happening, but no secondary involvement in it. That primary suffering in time, if the understanding goes even deeper, because the witnessing is the understanding witnessing, right? It is the understanding that is preventing involvement in the primary suffering. When you look at the primary suffering that there is no involvement in, the primary suffering has involvement. The primary suffering is involvement in circumstance. And so as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, eventually even the primary involvement falls away. And that to me is total peace of mind, where even the primary, but when there is a witnessing of that primary involvement, you could say that is peace of mind. It would feel like peace of mind relative to what was there before. Before there was involvement in the involvement, which means we were completely lost. There was no sense of self outside that was free. And I think, in a way, we don't want this concept to kick in as should or shouldn't, right? Because if we then insist on the end of suffering, meaning total, where not even the primary uncomfortableness arises, if that becomes a should, then that will create a resistance to the primary suffering when it arises. So none of this should be, just because we talk about different phases, it shouldn't be turned into an expectation. It's just a description, and we say, oh, well, fair enough, if it happens, it happens. And the biggest change is the change you describe, where there is no involvement in the primary suffering. That's the biggest change, because the sense of self has revealed itself. So now there is a degree of freedom. But if we use the definition that peace of mind is the total absence of suffering, then that description, even that with the suffering that is witnessed, eventually we would say even that ceases to arise.
And so you you never feel something like this in your body, like your body still, like you said in this video, that the old understanding of yourself is still in the body through some energy that have been unconscious, and sometimes it reacts by itself until it's revealed and may disappear at this moment. Something like that.
Well, in the process of in the process of the primary suffering that is witnessed turning into the absence of suffering, then before it has become the total absence of suffering, then yes, that would be the description, is that there is understanding, but there is still some energies in the body that include doership and attachment to outcome in them. And that's why the primary suffering is arising, and then it is witnessed. In time, those energies in the body that contain the remaining remnants of doership and attachment to outcome come out of the body. And that's another way of saying the belief or the sense of self, the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, or that psychological sense of self, the remnants of it are dissolved. So one way of saying it is the energy that holds that, or that contains it, the old energy from unresolved issues from the past, comes out. And the reason I say that is because in my experience, as part of the process, there is this cathartic release of old emotions. And it becomes very obvious that the sense of self is contained in those old emotions. Now, for the witnessing to kick in and for there to be deep understanding, doesn't require all of those old energies to come out. If some of them come out and there is enough space, then there will be the witnessing, and some will remain, and in time they will come out, if that's destined. And then there's just nothing left in the system to be triggered by circumstance. There will still be a triggering on the biological level by circumstance. So if someone pulls a gun out, or if a vicious dog is there will still be a biological reaction to the circumstance. But the psychological reaction won't arise, because the psychological sense of self has been completely eliminated. And I think that's just a matter of destiny and time.
That's I was thinking about understanding has been for me the big things, and I discover through the time that this understanding was there, and it was very sharp, but it didn't get rid of all the discomfort. It was like more like but I don't care about this discomfort. I'm not really attached to the end of suffering, because I knew that it was not a question of understanding, because I understood. It was a question of destiny, and if my program was programmed to be this way, okay, it will be like this. So, because sometimes when we call about total understanding, it's like a formula, some words, but it's not really understanding for me. It's like more like destiny at this moment.
Yeah, you're right, and the attitude you describe is 80, or that is the basic understanding. That is not basic. That is the key. Is it's all destiny. So I'm not going to get involved. Like, it'll happen or it won't happen, or who cares? You're just not involved. But what if destiny then? So destiny will happen, or destiny is always happening. And sometimes destiny would include an interest in the suffering. So your description was, I don't care because I don't care about the suffering because actually I'm not doing the suffering. Suffering is happening. Now, what that might, when you look at it, what it might be leading to as part of destiny is for some of the dynamics of suffering to go unappreciated because essentially there is not much interest in the suffering. Destiny might then turn around and go, but maybe it is important to be interested in the suffering, not in the old way of being attached to suffering or thinking you're doing it, but in a witnessing way, let's say, or in a curiosity way, in an observation way, to understand what the suffering is. Not necessarily understand in some total, just a simple, oh yes, this suffering is blame, right? And when we're not interested in the suffering, we might not see some of the subtle forms of suffering for what they are. If we then become interested in it again at the right time, because it will be destiny, we might see something that brings about or is part of the bringing about of the end of suffering, all of which is destiny, including your new interest in the suffering.
Yeah, I really felt this when I listened to this video I was talking about, because it was like, I listened to you quite a lot since a few months now, and it was the first time it was something like, for the first time, there was another intelligence who was talking instead of my Sadguru. I would say it was always myself who was talking to myself. And for the first time, it was something new, because when I listened to you, you were close to me, and I was agreeing with you, or sometimes a little bit make some remarks. But for the first time, you brought something in this satsang that I didn't sing by myself before, and it was really touching. My body was a little bit reacting, because I cried, I think, and it was like he was trying to say that it's important. Listen to this; it's important, and it was like, wow, cool. That's a new things, and I'm very curious about how life is going on because of my comprehension and all this. So it was like, that's maybe something interesting, and it has been a while that it was not like this.
Yeah, I would think that if you, I'll explain, because I don't know if I said it in that satsang, but there is a principle that I talk about sometimes, which is there are 3 movements in the spiritual seeking that are particularly important, especially in Advaita. The one that is most often spoken about is witnessing, right? And that happens when our understanding, and when I mean understanding, it's not just intellectual, it's where dynamics are really seen, right? Starting off as intellectual, and then our intellectual understanding allows us to actually see what is in the concept. And then a witnessing happens, a shift, a realization of the consciousness, let's say, and a seeing of things happening, including the movement of the body and the speaking and the thinking and all of that. And from that point of view, there is a non-involvement in what is happening. And that is very important. And most of the non-dual teaching is focuses on that witnessing. What we and sometimes we will interpret, because all we hear about is witnessing, witnessing, witnessing. We think that the journey becomes total when witnessing becomes most extreme. So if we find ourselves in the witnessing mode, there might be an insistence on witnessing more and more and more. And I think that this is why I bring in these other movements that at a certain time need to take over or happen complementary to witnessing. And that is to come into the body and allow the feelings to be fully felt. Because from the witnessing point of view, they arise, but we are not really interested in them. That means we don't really get to fully feel them, because we are sort of out of them, and we're not allowing them to develop, because we're not essentially in the personhood. So if we come back into the body, which in a way means witnessing has to stop for a bit, or at least the emphasis on witnessing has to have the possibility of being interfered with. And if we haven't heard that something other than witnessing is useful, then what happens is we remain witnessing. And that can then turn into a bypassing, rather than if witnessing continues beyond its time, at some point it will be a bypassing, and that bypassing will be the bypassing of feeling what is left to be processed. So that's why I suggest there is a time when we let witnessing sit on the shelf and just come in and feel the feelings. And those feelings might be, will be, the very unenlightened feelings, right? The guilt, the shame, the blame, the resentment, the pride, whatever is left in the system. And if we don't understand it as part of the liberation of those energies, then as soon as we see the mind and the feelings going back to what we know are involvement and suffering, we suddenly want to go into witnessing again, because in witnessing, there isn't that intensity. And so as long as, if the understanding that you've described is there, when someone hears about this, there's a resonance and says, yes, I knew something was missing. So then there can be this phase will happen as part of destiny. And if the witnessing understanding is very strong, it'll happen very, or it can happen very effortlessly, where the energies come out, and in a way there is still a witnessing happening. But it requires us to be able to embody being the person again. Then these deep energies can come out, crying, anger, wanting someone to really pay for what they did that hurt us, for example. All of that is contained in the emotion, and we will realize this is from a long time ago. And the witnessing will either witness it simultaneously, but in its intensity, which couldn't have happened unless the witnessing was let go of for a bit, or it is witnessed after it happens, which really means there is a appreciation that, wow, that was intense, but it was just a happening. And it might not need, the witnessing doesn't have to be there simultaneous to it. It will be afterwards. And what that feels like is that the energy comes out and then it just stops. So you can feel intense hatred, and it comes out, and from 1 second to the next second, there is just an emptiness, before there wasn't. There was all this rage and hatred. It comes out, and then there is a emptiness, and it's like, oh, that was just an energy. It was just a movement. It's not who I am. And it's just from the past, and it makes sense that it's from the past because these events happened, and in the past there was the belief in doership and attachment, and so they were locked away. This attitude was locked away in relation to the person and the event. Maybe it was the attitude to ourself. Comes out, and then that's the end of it. It doesn't only come out once. Sometimes this process can be over a period of months, and each day there could be this cathartic thing, and that's a little bit of it coming out each time until there's none left.
Anyway, it was quite interesting because there is another thing that I think I'm interested in is to have fun and to be curious about new things. So it's always also enjoyment to see how it goes through this process of life, and this is something that excites my curiosity to see how it goes, how it will go.
Yeah,
and because
it's not always the most fun, but it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I think about fun. It's about often when I was feeling some pain in my life or things like this, it was always curiosity of what's going to happen after that reduce also the pain. It was like let's see what's going to happen, but with a quite excitement even during the pain. So it was something like that for me. And just to finish, if you don't mind, because the sense of I am is not really something I have been into it. I mean, I've never been identified with consciousness or awareness. For me, the I was always referring to the all things. I mean, consciousness through this body. So some kind of a program. And so I refer myself as a program, being consciousness through this body. And so, and this program and this sense of I for me is a production, something that is maybe fake by the source. That so it was not really a place for me to be as a subject. When I was witnessing, it was more like that's the activity of the program.
Yeah, you see, this is very interesting. And I'm glad you brought it up because if you didn't say this, for example, and I have just spent the part of the satsang talking about the sense of I, then someone might think, oh, that hasn't happened, that should happen, or I wonder when that's going to happen. And I think it's important to say that that is one way that the sense of self with its involvement and its doership and attachment, that's one way that we can see beyond it. And I'm pretty sure, and in fact you are confirming from your experience, I'm pretty sure that there are other ways. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to go through that set of train stations, let's say, where there is this awareness of awareness. If there is another process that diminishes the sense of self, and this is why I say it's important for us to know enlightenment ultimately is the end of suffering. For a lot of people on the non-dual path, the end of suffering comes because the awareness aspect is realized. But if something else can dissolve the psychological self, because awareness, the awareness aspect, becoming aware of the awareness aspect, just allows us to rest outside of thinking for long enough for the psychological identity to be seen as a fiction, to dissolve, for the habit to dissolve. And then abiding in I am becomes irrelevant. In fact, it fades away, which I mentioned earlier. So abiding in I am is not it. It is just a means to an end, a means to the end of the psychological self. So I'm quite sure that there are different paths that don't include the awareness of self in the same way as is often described when people talk about out-of-body experiences and that sort of thing. And you've described it well. It's just once you know that our thinking is a program, is a concept, and once we really see it's a concept and we understand what concept is, and we can see that a concept could be anything. We can believe that, I don't know, there is someone standing outside our door about to break the door down, and it's just a thought, and it can feel so real. And then when it passes, we realize why, that's interesting that there was this certainty about someone being outside the door, and when we look at it, it was just a concept, and the concept can be very powerful. And so once we become clear of that we are a program or a set of thoughts moving through awareness, that too can diminish the sense of I am my thoughts, because something else knows that the concept is a concept, something, or at least another concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, it's good for you, this topic to have been brought up, so that some people who haven't experienced the awareness of self in the way I describe, and in fact not only the way I'm describing it, but the way the majority of non-dual teachings describe it, it's important to know there's another way. Otherwise, someone might be craving or thinking that needs to happen, when in fact peace of mind has already happened. And when I speak to you, I can tell that there is a very deep understanding that leads to a lack of involvement in what is happening, and yet it doesn't cut off your curiosity, your connection to life. It's not like it's apparent that there isn't a total bypassing, because you can have the idea it's all, we're just a program, and that can create a disconnection from the juice of life.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't get that sense from you.
No.
Yeah.
Because I think when I was referring to what would be my best way to live life, or to be lived, it would be like when I have a lucid dream. Lucid dream. Because when those dreams happen, it's like the best thing in my life, to feel a lot of things, to discover a lot of things, to have fun, but without any fear, any discomfort, any anxiety. And that's if I could live my life like this all the time, that would be great. So that's my curiosity has always been here, and my enjoyment of life has always been not like sometimes I was rejecting life, of course, but I was like, if it's just a movie, a dream, or whatever, just let's have fun. That's all.
Yeah, but though that if the dream
fun, I love to be sad sometimes. I love to feel pain. Well, this depends on the pain, but sadness is something very great. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. It's often got love at its core, right? Yeah, but that's a great gift to find yourself at peace with all of these things, including sadness. The dream for a lot of people includes the absence of peace. So I agree that living life free of suffering is as good as it gets, but that's destiny, right?
Yeah, and that's what, as you say, God wants to live. So that's he chooses sometimes this and sometimes that. So anyway, thank you very much, Roger, and I'll let you with the people if they want to ask other things. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francois. Let's see if we have 10 minutes. So it's Harleen and Cecilia. Hi, Harleen.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
So I wanted to speak to you about this. So in the last week, I was, quite peaceful, and then there was this instance which got me very involved and very attached to the outcome, which lasted for like 2-3 days until the outcome was delivered to me. So it was just like me claiming insurance for the damage in my car. So the car went to the workshop, and the surveyor, the investigator, came to check on the car and gave 50% of the claim, when it's only fair for them to give me 100% of the damage, not 50%. And then there was a lot of blame to the surveyor and to the workshop guy, to the workshop people, because I purchased my insurance through them. They were meant to be negotiating for me, and I found them not be negotiating effectively. Yeah. And then there was also a lot of and this is life is unfair. It's like, they are meant to do that. They cannot not. I'm genuinely claiming the damage. People in India get their way out by lying on the claim form. Yeah. So just your thoughts. Yeah.
Did you get your 100% in the end, or just the 50%?
No, I did.
You didn't? Oh, good. Well, you're laughing about it.
No, I did.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did. So
that's why you're laughing.
Yeah. But then those 3 days, I was like, okay, Roger says to not be attached to the outcome. But then I have to be very indifferent to be negotiating. But then I couldn't be indifferent because it was like a big deal at that time.
Well, that just demonstrates the attachment, right? Because not being attached doesn't mean that you want to push for the 100%. So if there is non-attachment to the outcome, there is still the potential for you to say, look, this isn't, I can't understand why you only paid 50%. It was, not my fault, or whatever your rationale was. Knowing that even though you give your reasons, you are not in control of the outcome, right? So the non-attachment doesn't mean we go, oh, well, they said 50%, so let me not question it. You can still question it, but the outcome might not be in your favor. If you see that you are questioning it and there is blame and it is not acceptable if they don't give you 100%, then you can just call it what it is and you go, yes, there was attachment. That's it. That's actually there's a great opportunity there to call attachment and not want it to not be. It's not about whether it should or shouldn't be there. it is there, and it is attachment. And you say, there it is, I see it, there's no question about it. And then if it remains, you can say, and this is definitely making the pain of, the financial pain that you might have to incur. This is definitely adding a whole extra layer on top of the financial pain that is my suffering and is making me uncomfortable. And so at some point you might say, well, my uncomfortableness isn't going to change the outcome. Like once let's say it's been ruled and they've told you, look, you can tell it, you've spoken to the managing director and he's still ruled as in that way. At some point you realize, my blame and my resentment is just my suffering, which is making the situation worse. It's not helping, which doesn't mean it might not end. But those are the sort of realizations about it that is what may contribute to it coming to an end. Where we say, I'm just looking to be happy, and this resentment is just unhappiness. So then we need a basis on which that is understandable. And so you say, life is not fair. Life is destiny unfolding, and sometimes my destiny will be pain in the moment. This is my karma, you could say, or whatever you want to say, and move on. In this case, you're lucky you didn't have to reconcile with the pain, because it turned into pleasure.
Yeah, I would probably be talking about it from a very different energy. Yeah, but also, if you could, there have been instances where I think that life is being unfair. So say, there was this one instance where it could have turned out to be revengeful, but then thank God it's been a year, and this is another instance, and good that I did not take that path. But then there's also, if you could speak about the revenge that arises out of life being unfair on us, on me.
Yeah, well, if you do take the revenge, it could lead to very unfortunate circumstances that actually won't fix the problem, but you might get into much more trouble, and you will see that the revenge is something you're forced into. And then if you do something that hurts the other or something damages their property, and you might get into have criminal charges, maybe people kill other people, and then they spend the rest of their life in prison, which is all their destiny. But when you look at it from an outside perspective, you think, wow, that revenge movement is not worth it, really, from an objective point of view. That's probably why you said, thankfully, you weren't pushed down that movement, down that path. So if we have enough insight into something like that, then when the revenge feeling comes up in the future, something else might come up that mitigates it and say, this just isn't worth it. And that might cut it off. It might not. I'll see if I can just address Cecilia. I won't have time for Raghu. I saw he's just put his hand up now. But I'll have a quick chat with Cecilia, so I hope that helps, Harleen. Hi, Cecilia.
Hi, Roger. I was trying to, I'll try to make this as brief as possible. I was just, because you've mentioned a couple of things today. First of all, I have sort of three things, if I may. So what is the most expedient way, or how is the solution of the psychological self achieved most expediently?
You have to bribe God.
Oh, you have to bribe God? Okay. All right. So it's a question of destiny, if I understand.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
You talked about knowing ourselves there in the I amness. So again, how is this most expediently achieved?
Bribe God.
As well? Okay. So it's a question of destiny. There's not like the abiding in the now and understanding that is really all there is.
Yeah, well, your destiny can include being exposed to satsang, for example. And satsang, with all of its pointers, all that satsang is 2 hours of pointers. And any one of those pointers may lead to a progression of what would seem like my insight, but that is just destiny unfolding. So destiny includes, destiny is not just a magical outcome. Destiny could include the things that lead to that outcome. And so all of satsang is a set of pointers, and a lot of the pointers in satsang are pointers about what our suffering is, and a suggestion that become aware for yourself based on your own daily life experience of everything that is spoken about. The suffering, realize that the suffering is your unhappiness, that if the suffering gets cut off, then the circumstance which might be painful is there, but it doesn't have this extra load of uncomfortableness on top of it. So all of these things are destiny unfolding if they transpire, if an investigation happens, if these insights happen. And the fact that you might want to think this way and you might want the insights to happen, whether it actually happens, that is destiny. And another of the pointers is that the suffering gets cut off when it is seen as suffering, and then we drop into a dimension that is outside of thinking. Presence, you could say, just presence with what is here. So what is happening now often is not the circumstance that we are ruminating over. And so if you can bring attention into the present moment, where there is no other in the present moment, let's say, no other that is present in your memory of the event that you are involved in. So you come into the present moment and the mental picture can get cut off. And so, any of those things, if they happen, are positive movements towards the end of suffering.
Well, from listening to you, and then this being like a sort of culmination of everything that all the pointers that I've exposed myself to through destiny throughout my life up until now, I like to think that luckily I'm getting, it's happening. I can't explain it, but it's happening. The non-involvement, the stuff, everything that you've mentioned. So it brings great peace of mind. You've helped a lot to really be the living embodiment of, what I discovered over the years. And I wanted to ask you too, I'm reading a book called Living the Life That You Are by a man called Nick Hyam, and he talks about essential aliveness, being in essential aliveness. I presume that this is that same I amness, beingness. Would I be
Sounds
correct
like
in,
it, yeah.
Would I be correct in some, defining it, like understanding it that way?
Well, without seeing it in context of a paragraph, let's say, I don't know for sure, but just the particular words, essential aliveness, suggests that that's what he's talking about, meaning the very fundamental, primordial sense of existence that precedes all of the various mental states and emotional states, and outlives all of the mental and emotional states that come and go. And so if you have contact to that which is, primordial, Adyashanti's name actually means primordial. The Adya is primordial and Shanti is peace. So the primordial peace comes from the primordial aliveness. And primordial basically meaning that which is fundamental, that which is before all of the other movements. And so if we rest in that primordial state, that's where there is freedom from those other movements.
Yeah, because
they can still happen.
I realize that, I have that, but I also have that other. I think that it is now being integrated. It's being integrated the way that you talk about, but I still have this, and life unfolds through this as well, like that. I don't have the words anymore, but so I'm very happy, and I want to thank you, really, because you helped me a lot. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Pleasure. So on that note, thank you everyone, and peace for now.